Hey guys, it's Allie. Welcome back to Infertile AF, the podcast. This is episode 225 called Lisa McCarty. This podcast is sponsored by RECEPTIVA DX. RECEPTIVA DX is a powerful test that has helped thousands of women who have experienced recurrent pregnancy loss or IVF failure. The test helps detect inflammatory conditions of the uterus that might be preventing you from becoming pregnant or staying pregnant. The most common underlying condition of a positive RECEPTIVA DX test is endometriosis with or without symptoms. If you or someone you know has struggled with IVF, RECEPTIVA DX may give you the answer and treatment protocols that you're looking for. Talk with your doctor about RECEPTIVA DX because the journey is so worth it. Plus, guys, Infertile AF listeners are getting $75 off the RECEPTIVA DX test. So all you have to do is go to receptivadx.com or download the app RECEPTIVA DX, use code INFERTILEAF23, and you'll get $75 off. Thanks, RECEPTIVA DX. Okay, guys, I'm so excited about this episode today because Lisa McCarty is so open about her story and everything she's been through on her infertility journey. Guys, she did 14 transfers, and that's not even the half of it. So she is going to talk a lot about that. She's going to talk about Asherman syndrome. She's going to talk about recurrent miscarriage, secondary infertility, therapy, the anxiety of pregnancy after infertility, mental health, and so much more. So I will let her say it in her words. Without further ado, this is Lisa's infertility story. Hi, Lisa. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I'm good. Thank you so much for doing this. So I would love to just start at the beginning, as I always do, and ask, did you always want to be a mom?
You know, I didn't actually. That's kind of probably a shocking answer.
But actually, a lot of people say that, I feel like.
Well, I would say, I was hyper career focused early in my life. And in fact, when I met my now husband, we've been together 17 years. Mm-hmm. I really wasn't even looking to be, with anyone because I was so focused on my career. And then we got married and we were together a long time and then, got married. And I felt like it just like the light bulb went off, the light switch went off, whatever you call it, where you sort of just all of a sudden the hormones kicked in and I was like, I need to get pregnant. Mm-hmm. I need to be a mom. And something changed. And I remember he was giving me kind of a hard time about it. He was like, where is this coming from? Slow down,
Yeah.
And just all of a sudden it sort of hit me and I just thought it would be easy for us. And it was the opposite of easy. So that's kind of, my experience with wanting to be a mom. I don't think I really did. And then it changed.
Okay. Let's talk about what happened when you guys started to try.
So, I wasn't actually having a period for about 3 years prior to us trying. And so we started to try, and I guess I just thought things would figure themselves out. Like my body would just sort of reset at some point. And I ended up going to my OB because I didn't understand, what was happening. And she said to me, well, if you're not getting a period, obviously you're not ovulating and it's not possible to get pregnant. So you really need to talk to a specialist. And I remember feeling sort of overwhelmed in that moment. Like, does that mean there's something wrong with me? And so I went and saw an endocrinologist who became my doctor for almost 10 years. And he was just so reassuring and just said, we're going to figure this out. So we sat down, we talked about it and realized that after 15 plus years of being on the pill, that I had post-pill amenorrhea. And essentially what that means in English is after, roughly 6 months after going off the pill, your periods can stop. And it happened for me a lot longer than that. And so essentially we started with putting me back on the pill, ironically, to reset my system. And I think a lot of people who've been through IVF and the fertility journey know that process.
Right.
And for me, I really wasn't thrilled about it because when I was on the pill, I had a lot of headaches and had a lot of issues, and it affected my mental health, like my moods. And so I really wasn't thrilled about going back on it, but obviously we didn't really have a choice.
Yeah.
So
had you heard of that before, that diagnosis?
No,
Okay.
I hadn't. Yeah.
So what did your doctor tell you about it? Like, how common is it? What were the, symptoms and all that? Like, obviously it was that you weren't getting your period, but what did anything else come along with it?
He didn't really give me a ton of information. He just said, we need to reset your system. And the way to do that is to put you back on the pill. And so the information that I was given was really like, here are your options going forward. It wasn't really, why is this happening to me? And so in hindsight, I would have liked a little bit more, sort of background or context as to why it was happening, because I realize now it was as a result of the pill. And I wish I would have addressed some of those concerns and not feeling well while I was on the pill, for so long. And I would have stopped it earlier if I had known. Anyway, but I think, I try to keep a positive perspective at all times, even going through fertility. And so from there, we sat down and we talked about options, and he basically said, we need to do all the testing that they do at the very beginning of any treatment. And they had to kind of rule out any potential issues, chronic illnesses or anything going on. And so, wanted to check my husband's fertility level and all of that. And then we tried IUI. And so that was the first part. And I honestly wasn't too vested in IUI. Like, I just really was thinking, if my body doesn't know what to do without medication, it seems like maybe I'm going to need a little more help. Intuitively, I felt like it was going to take a lot more for us. And so, I was hoping it would work, but I really wasn't too confident about it. And so
how many IUIs did you do? Just one or more?
We did a couple. We did maybe like 3 or 4. And then at that point, my doctor was like, I don't think this is working. I think we need to make a new plan. They were all negative. It wasn't, a loss. It was just a negative outcome. And so basically we reevaluated. And I remember he called me and he said, based on, what I'm seeing, it seems like you would be a good candidate for IVF. And so we talked about what that meant, and we talked about the stimulation drugs and all that. And he said, I think I was trying to coax him into considering putting more than one in when we did the transfer. And he was like, because I really wanted twins at the time. And he was like, no, based on your frame and your body type and everything, I think we got to start with one and see how it goes. And so we did one IVF, and the first one worked. For me, I felt really lucky because I did have a few friends that were going through it, and I felt super lucky that was, our outcome. This was almost 2 years into treatment.
Okay. So, wait, can we back up a little bit? So how many embryos did you have at the end of your first cycle, and did you get them tested?
We did not do embryo testing the first time before my first IVF. As far as the total, gosh, it was so long ago. I'm going to guess that it was somewhere around 14, and they did not all survive. So they did not make it all to that blastocyst phase. And so I think we ended up with roughly like 7.
Okay.
Yeah. So
you transferred the one, and
number one. Yeah.
And it worked.
And that's my daughter, and she's just turned 10.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing.
Which is amazing. And I thought, okay, this is it, and then, so that was the first one. And then from there, I think I waited, it was about a year and a half. We kind of paused, and then we started again because I decided I wanted a second, and that sort of feeling came back again, as we're all probably familiar, that want to become a mom again. And I felt like it was easy. The first, quote, easy, almost 2 years for me felt easy. And it wasn't, it was the opposite. We went through almost 4 years of just exhaustion and emotional roller coaster.
So what else was going on, like medically?
We started at the beginning with using the remaining embryos that we had. And my endocrinologist said to me, I think we have a really good shot. You had success on the first IVF. And he was really hopeful and always very supportive. But, from a mental health perspective, I was definitely feeling stressed and anxious because it was a lot of waiting. Obviously, you go through this process and you think it's going to be, stimulation, and then you do all the injections and you do your trigger, and then you do your transfer, and then it's the 2-week wait. And it sort of became autopilot. So I don't think at the beginning of the process of that, years of treatment, I felt like we were going to struggle. But then as we got into that last year, I had 4 losses in a row. We were getting a lot of negative results. So essentially it was like all negative tests.
Okay. So you were doing the transfers, but the transfers were not working.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And they did several hysteroscopies during that process. And we did another round of stimulation as well. So we used basically the remainder of the 6 embryos. And then we had to do more stimulation because I ran out. And so I think we got another 7. So it was a total of basically 14 transfers.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Girl, I've been through the ringer.
Oh.
That's not even all of it.
Okay.
So anyway, so we used all the remaining embryos. Those were all negative. And my endocrinologist, after these 4 losses, he, every single time he was like hopeful, this is going to work. And then I would get the call, and the first day it would be like the blood work was good. And then the second time they would call back, things were not doubling again. And it was like that just utter devastation where you're just, like, what am I doing wrong?
So you're getting like a positive beta, but they weren't, it didn't end up resulting in pregnancy.
For those 4 losses, and I feel like even now, like it's been 4 years, since I was done with all of that, since we had our second. And I'm still just dealing with a lot of this.
Totally. Absolutely.
A long
let's talk about the mental health piece of this, because I know that's important to you.
Yeah.
What was going on with you, like mentally, and also your husband, and how did it affect your relationship too?
Yeah. So I would say the first couple of losses, like the first 3 losses, I kept saying, I kept trying to be that positive person that I am, and, trying to take care of myself mentally. Like I'm trying to go to yoga, and I'm trying to, have some mindfulness time and do my therapy, which I would say is the number one thing that got me through all of that. I can't advocate for therapy enough. And I had an amazing psychologist who specialized in something called OCD. And I don't know if you're familiar, but it's essentially where you sort of obsess. And anyone who's gone through fertility probably feels that way too. But anyone who's gone through it feels that sense of anxiety. But this for me was extreme. And so I was having a lot of intrusive thoughts about, thinking the worst. So every time, for example, like we would do a transfer and then I had a loss, I would go through the transfer again, and I would try to be positive for that 2-week period. And then it happened again, and it happened again, and it happened again. And so by the 4th one, I was on the bathroom floor crying my eyes out. And my husband, Ryan, came and laid with me on the floor, and he's holding me and he's telling me, like, we're going to figure this out. And I'm like, nobody knows what's happening. Like, nobody can figure this out. What is wrong with me? And at that point I felt like a complete failure, and also a disappointment to him, because he wanted to get pregnant again.
Yeah.
And, I think it's one of those things where you put so much pressure on yourself. And, in life and in work, that's just always the way that I've been for myself. I'm like an overachiever. I got to get everything done. And so for pregnancy, I thought it would be, the same. Anyway, so we're in the midst of this last loss, and I felt like he too was feeling it. He's in tears with me on the floor, and we're talking about this, and he's like, we're going to figure it out. So I think it took a few weeks for us to kind of, and especially me, to kind of get my myself together. And that last one, I didn't bleed as much as the third one. The third one, I felt like was debilitating. I was in the bathroom, just blood pouring out of me. Like I didn't know what was happening. But this is even before they actually called me with a negative test.
Oh God.
Yeah. So it's just then I started feeling lightheaded, and then they asked me to come in, and he's like, we got to do a DNC, like, and so it was even more like, emotional in that moment. 'Cause you're just like, oh, this is really final. Like, it's not just a failure, or it's not just a negative, but it's like, there's something seriously not working here.
Right. And you're probably nervous about your health and what's going to happen next. And there's so many emotions that go through your mind at that moment. I think anybody who has been through that can relate for sure. I'm so sorry you had to go through all that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think, but as the saying goes, what doesn't break you makes you stronger. And I feel like what happened next was life-changing for us, because we were able to sort of move forward. So I went back in a few weeks later after the fourth loss and talked to my endocrinologist, and he's, got that serious look on his face. Like, he said to me, in my 30 years of practice, I have never seen a case like yours. I have never seen someone where we throw the kitchen sink at you, literally, every kind of medication. We did our ERA. We did, all the protocols. We changed things up. We, tried to determine, was it the timing? Was it, medication? Was it the trigger shot? Was it, some underlying thing that they didn't test for? I think I recall they did some additional testing again. And then he looked at me and he was like, I think you need to see a specialist. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, aren't you the specialist? Like,
right. Yeah. What next?
What does that mean?
Totally.
And so he said that he had someone that he trusted and that he had worked with before. And he couldn't promise anything, of course, but he wanted me to see him. And he's based here in DC, and he specializes in these situations. I became the situation. And so I went to see him, and I will say it was one of those moments where I felt completely validated, like somebody understood. So this person is an OB, but he also OBGYN, but he is also a specialist in something called Asherman syndrome.
Yep.
Have you guys talked about that? I wasn't
We
sure.
have, yeah, in several episodes, or like a handful. Yeah. It's come up a bunch of times.
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know what it is, essentially it's, scar tissue in the uterus, which can trigger recurrent miscarriage. And so I knew nothing about that when I went to him. And so, that was very stressful, leading up until then. And then I would say I felt some sense of relief, feeling like we were going to have a direction. And so we did some treatments. And essentially what that means is, they do the hysteroscopy, and then in between the treatments, it was a series of 4 for me. And in the treatments, they basically remove the scar tissue while you're awake in the office. It's an outpatient procedure in a special exam room at the hospital. And they take the scar tissue out while you're awake, while you're watching it on camera, which was a little stressful.
Yeah.
But I also felt like, okay, this guy is going to help me. Things are going to get better. They have to get better. And so we went to a series of those appointments, 4 in a row, and they were a couple of weeks apart because I had to take estrogen in between to heal the lining of the uterus. And essentially that would hopefully, at the time he said it would help to prevent the scar tissue from recurring. And so we went back after that 4th appointment, and he said, I don't see anything. And I was like crying in the office, like thinking, are we finally like here? I mean, it still wasn't a guarantee that I was going to get pregnant again, but it was that just, so many years of trying and so much loss.
Right.
And to say, I think we figured it out. And so then I know, obviously I walk out to the waiting room to my husband and gave him a big hug, and we're both in tears. And it was just a huge sense of relief, like that black cloud, finally, maybe we had figured something out. So, So anyway, so then we went back to my endocrinologist and we talked about a plan, and I had one embryo left.
Mm-hmm.
And so my doctor at the time said, basically, this is our last shot. If this does not work, he actually, I'll back up. Actually, he had to go to his board before we decided that. He, because I'm such a rare case, because I'm always the 1% of everything.
Right.
He said, I need to consult my board with this situation and make sure that, this is a good idea to put you through this again, because we were talking about surrogacy at this point, because I had one left. He said, if this doesn't work, we're going to have to look at surrogacy. And they gave me all the paperwork, and I was on board 100% because I just wanted to be a mom again. I just wanted to, have a sibling for my daughter. And I didn't care what that looked like. If we had to adopt, fine, let's do that. Let's whatever it takes. And so he consulted with his board, and he came back and he said, they gave us one more shot. And we're both like laughing on the phone because it's crazy. Like, almost 15 rounds of IVF and so many things.
This episode is sponsored by HelloFresh. With HelloFresh, you get farm fresh, pre-proportioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. You can skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. And that's why it's America's #1 meal kit. HelloFresh does more than just delicious dinners. Not only can you take your pick from 40 weekly recipes, but you can choose from over 100 items to round out your order, from snacks and easy lunches to desserts and pantry necessities. Everything arrives in one box on a delivery day that you choose. No worries, guys. If you're not a pro in the kitchen, HelloFresh's foolproof recipes arrive pre-portioned and easy to prepare in just a few easy steps. I have personally tried and loved HelloFresh. It saves time, it makes cooking so easy and fast, and everything I've tried from HelloFresh is super delicious. So here's the thing. Go to HelloFresh.com/InfertileAF16 and use code InfertileAF16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. I mean, I don't know if it gets any better than that. Again, you can go to HelloFresh.com/InfertileAF16 and use code InfertileAF16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. I know everybody listening is looking for fresh, easy, healthy meals. So guys, please check out HelloFresh and make sure that you check out America's #1 meal kit.
Putting your body through so much too.
So much.
Can you tell me about like the physical toll that it took on you as well, going through so many rounds of that?
Yeah. And I would say that the biggest physical toll was sort of just like that feeling of exhaustion, mentally and physically, despite still going to yoga and doing all the mindfulness and therapy, I just generally felt exhausted. And because I already had a child, like this was our second we were trying for, I felt even more exhausted and drained and trying to sort of hide that a little bit from her because she was so young at the time.
Right.
That feeling like, my kid has to, because they sense our energy. They
100%.
sense our anxiety and our mood. And they call it, I think, emotional attunement. When you walk into the room and someone can feel how you feel and you sort of change, like if somebody walks in a bad mood or whatever, it's sort of the same thing, like you adjust your mood. And I wondered sometimes if she could feel that. So generally I would say, my physical self was just exhausted. And I know my husband felt the same way, but he just never showed it. He has always been my rock, my grounded place. And whenever I felt sort of overwhelmed, he was the person that I, sort of relied on to help me. And I'm grateful for that every step of the way. He got me through it, in addition to my therapist, of course. So,
right. Therapy.
Um,
So yeah, tell me about the therapy. Like what were the things that you were talking about and like that you wanted to kind of get the tools to
mhm.
learn how to navigate?
Yeah. So, are you familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT? Do you?
I've heard of it, but I've
Okay.
never done it myself. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I didn't know what it was before I started doing it, but essentially CBT is where you are, there's kind of four different things that I think I can, share as far as lessons from my therapy and what we were working on. The number one thing we worked on for CBT was sort of the pathway of thinking. And so for me, and I forgot to mention this, but after I delivered my first Ella, I had complications with delivery. And so that was really traumatizing. In addition to all this infertility stuff, that was one of the things that we talked about and in my therapy. And so the change of pathway of thinking really comes. He always said to me, "You can't change the thought going into your mind, but you can change your response to it."
Mm-hmm.
And so what that means in English is basically like, I was having fear of more loss, and I was having fear that something would happen to me, and just thinking the extreme. And he would say, okay, so that thought is going into your mind, but your response to it needs to change. And so
Right.
instead of thinking about what could happen and the what if, he always also told me to remain present and stay where you are right now instead of focusing on what could potentially happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, one of the things we worked on was working through the trauma that I had after my delivery. So I had a retained placenta. They spent 45 minutes trying to get it out. And I think roughly it's 30 to 60 minutes that they have a window of time to get it out after delivery before it becomes, an issue of hemorrhage. And I ended up losing a lot of blood during
Mm-hmm.
that manual, trying to take it out. And they rushed me to emergency D&C. I had lost a lot of blood. And so that was really traumatic when I woke up, because the delivery was relatively uneventful for me with her. And then I was worried about the same thing, the retained placenta happening again. And so then going through the losses, we worked through this in therapy as well, that I was afraid, I was just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Mm-hmm.
Every time that I would go through a cycle, because I had had so many failed cycles. And then after the losses, it was the same thing. I'm afraid that I'm going to have another loss. And then when it came to that last transfer, the number 7 one that we had one more shot, I was really anxious throughout that process. And I talked to my therapist every 2 weeks at that time. And I remember we were chatting in the session just before I got the results. And he said, "You can't control any of this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you really need to come to realization. You can't control any of this." And I knew that, but I needed somebody to say it to me.
Right.
So much of infertility is that you have zero control.
Yep.
And that, for someone with anxiety, or even if you don't, that's super stressful. And
Mm-hmm.
it feels debilitating in some way. And so I went in, I got the blood work, and it was positive. And then the numbers kept doubling. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm going to have a miscarriage again. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
lose this again. And he kept saying, stop thinking the worst and just focus on the present. Today, you're still pregnant.
Yep.
Today, today the
Yes.
numbers are good.
It's
Today,
so
they
funny.
saw a heartbeat,
Yeah. I mean, not funny, but it's interesting that
It's
you say that,
ironic.
because
Yeah.
in fertility rally, groups, support groups and stuff, we say that a lot. And that
Yeah.
sometimes that's all you can do is, today I am pregnant. This
Yeah.
moment, this hour,
Yeah.
sometimes it's hour by hour, sometimes it's minute by minute, but
Yeah.
you're right. There's not much you can control, if anything, sometimes. And so I think that's a
Yeah.
good way to try and reframe it, just to get through the moment, even.
Yeah. Especially for people who are control freaks.
Right.
Because, it's really, it's a hard lesson, but it's so true. And then, so with regard to, not thinking the worst and intrusive thoughts. The other thing was when I was pregnant. So we did end up getting pregnant and staying pregnant with my second. And I was just terrified of sharing it with anyone.
Yes.
Because I was afraid as soon as I said it out loud that something bad would happen. And I mean, do you call that superstitious? I don't know.
I know. Yeah, I think so. But I think it makes a lot of sense. And I can totally relate to that. And I'm sure so many other people can too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so we got to about 22 weeks and then I started bleeding, and it wasn't just a little bit of blood. And I didn't have any bleeding with my first pregnancy, the pregnancy where I stayed pregnant with my daughter. And I started having bleeding, and it was a lot of blood. And I called, at this point I had graduated from fertility treatment and from the clinic and to an OBGYN and an MFM because I was almost 40 at this point. They call it a geriatric pregnancy when you're over 35, which is ridiculous.
I've said so many times before, I hate that term. Get rid of that term. Just ban it.
So ridiculous. I think it originated in the UK, right?
I have no idea, but it needs to go away.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So anyway, so I had actually two OBs. One was a specialist maternal fetal medicine, and who was fantastic. I can't say enough about her. And then a regular OBGYN as well. And so I called them, this is like, I don't know, 8:00 at night, 9:00 at night, my daughter's asleep. I'm having an anxiety attack, like what is going on? Everything was fine. I'm finally in a place where I'm content. Mm-hmm. And then, I started bleeding. And so they brought me in. I was basically, they didn't know what was wrong. They hooked me up to the monitor. They could see the baby was still moving. And everything was fine, which of course, immediate relief as the mom. But on the other end of the spectrum, they couldn't figure out what was causing the bleeding and they didn't know how to stop it. And so I had to be basically monitored for 24 hours until my OB could come, which was ridiculous because, they had someone on call, but she didn't come until a couple of hours later because she was, dealing with emergencies. Anyway, so my doctor at the time, she had been in practice for like a million years. She's actually no longer with us. She ended up passing away a few years after my son was born. But anyway, so she came in and she looked at me and she was just the most bold, unfiltered person. She's a Brit and I just loved her because she just, she didn't give you any BS. Like she just said, here's what's happening. You need to chill out. Like, and she said, we can't figure out where the bleeding's coming from, but you're safe and everything's okay. And the baby's okay. And so we're going to figure this out. And then she left. And so in the morning, they wheeled me down to my maternal fetal medicine doc, who's, the specialist in this area. And they did a lot of imaging and tried to figure it out. And it turned out that it was me that was bleeding. My uterus was bleeding and it wasn't part of the placenta, thank God. So anyway, the whole time I'm like, I'm finally content. My anxiety is coming down. I'm finally like in a good place where I feel safe in this pregnancy. And then this happened. And so fortunately the bleeding stopped and I was able to go home. So I was really grateful and everything was okay. And then from there, we didn't have any issues. And then as we got closer to the end of my pregnancy, I started having a lot of anxiety again because I was worried about the hemorrhage happening again. And so my husband, was always reassuring and, he seemed okay. But then I was talking to my therapist about it. And so I said to him, and I can laugh now because it's funny, but at the time it wasn't. I said to him, I'm terrified that I'm going to hemorrhage again. I'm going to have another retained placenta and then I'm going to die in childbirth. And then he said to me, well, you've got to stop what ifing the situation, number one. But he said, well, if you die, then it's not going to matter because you won't be alive. You won't know. And I was like, I know. And I like bust out laughing when he said that. And I was like, what? But, essentially he was trying to rationalize the fear to say, this intrusive thought that you're having, you can't control it again. You got to focus on the present, and let's just hope that doesn't happen. And your doctors are prepared. They know what happened before. You have a 7% chance of hemorrhaging again and having another retained placenta, but it's probably not going to happen. And so I felt better after that. My anxiety definitely went down. And I was doing all the things, therapy, and I was meditating daily, and I was doing yoga. I was taking walks. Those were kind of my big 4 go-tos. And then delivered, and everything was okay, but they didn't get the placenta completely out, and it was like happening again. They looked at the ultrasound and they were like, I think we got it all. So then a week postpartum, I started having stomach pain, and they brought me in for an ultrasound. So anyway, so I go in, they do the ultrasound, and she says, I go back up for the evaluation with the doctor after they look at the imaging, and she says, you have retained placenta. You have 2 options. And I was like, okay. And so the 2 options were, number 1, to give me medication. And I'm like, no, or do a D&C. And I said, I think that makes a lot more sense. And so it was supposed to be a 45-minute procedure. Let's get this thing done. You're going to be fine. I have a 1-week-old at home at this point.
Right.
And go in for the procedure. I remember they took me back. I woke up, whatever, amount of time later after anesthesia wore off, and I was in debilitating pain, and I was crying, and I'm like, what is happening? And the nurse looked down at me, and she's like, you hemorrhaged a liter of blood. You have to stay here for 24 hours or 48 hours
God.
and be monitored. And I'm like,
Scary.
Oh my God, my biggest fear almost came true. And so, they basically had to insert like a balloon, and my iron levels were significantly low. And my husband came, and he walked in the room, and he looked pale, and he's like, oh my God, we almost lost you. And it was literally all of the things that I had feared came true. And so I would say, through my entire process, the biggest thing that I have learned is that you always have to advocate for yourself, number 1, because I knew something was wrong when this happened, in just after delivery. But overall, I feel like therapy has saved my life. And I would say, mental health is the number 1 thing that people do not talk about when it comes to infertility.
Right.
And, when you go in for your checks and they do your blood work, after these transfers, and, they tell you the verdict, the only person that you have left is, you to deal with the mental health piece. And they're not checking on you. And, I don't fault anyone, in that world, at the clinic. I think they did an amazing job. They did their job, but I wished that I had a community, to talk with about it. And in my second pregnancy, I did have a friend who was actually going through fertility treatment at the same time in the same clinic. So I was really lucky, but I didn't have that in my first pregnancy. And if I didn't have a therapist, I feel like I probably wouldn't have gotten through all of that, or maybe I would have, but it wouldn't have been as sort of healing as it is now. I've found so many ways to cope. And so I feel like the biggest takeaways for me have been my 4 go-to things. Number 1, therapy. If you don't have a therapist, find someone you trust to talk to that's a medical expert, hopefully, a psychologist or someone that specializes in anxiety or trauma or whatever it is that you've gone through. And then the number 2 thing for me has been mindfulness. And it sort of sounds cliche, but really sitting down, being alone with yourself and being quiet and sitting in stillness and sort of just clearing your mind and letting go of all the things that are happening. Because I feel like in that moment when I was going through all of that, at every point of my journey, I feel like I needed to disconnect from what was happening, because it felt so overwhelming.
Yeah. That makes so much sense.
Yeah. And then exercise for me too has been so cathartic. I can go on a walk and I feel like, just even a 10-minute walk. I've actually read that, from an anxiety standpoint, that even a 10-minute walk can be as effective as a 45-minute walk or run, because it can calm anxiety. It can kind of tamp down on that fight or flight feeling when you're totally overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last piece I would say is community. I had a friend, like I said, that I went through with it, but I wished that when I was going through it with both of my pregnancies, that I would have had someone else, a community to talk to. And I'm so glad that you have created this, because I feel like I'm almost healing from so many years of treatment now.
Oh gosh, thank you for saying that. Yeah, that's what it's all about. It's just, sharing all these stories and stuff. So thanks for saying that.
Yeah, no. And thank you for sharing, your story and being so transparent in all of this. Cause I feel like, to have, like you said, a safe place to talk about it, it's cathartic, and it makes you feel like you're, heard and seen and validated, and, you're not alone.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for listening. You guys are the best. Thank you for all the emails and DMs and just letting me know that you guys are really being helped by this podcast. It means so much to me. So if you have 2 seconds and you can go rate and review it on Apple, that helps too, just with exposure. If you haven't done that, I would really appreciate it if you did. Also, if you're looking for a community, check out Fertility Rally. You guys have heard me talk about it a million times, but it is the place I wish I had when I was going through this. We're accepting new members all the time. No matter what you're going through, we will meet you where you're at. We've got so many support groups. We're adding more and more, I feel like, each month. So we currently have 4 to 5 per week, and we're adding more this summer. So check us out on Instagram at Fertility Rally. Check us out on the interwebs at fertilityrally.com. You can always DM me at Infertile AF Stories if you have any questions directly about the membership, what it includes, all that stuff. We're also having an IRL event in Chicago in August where people are going to come. We're going to spend the whole weekend bonding and doing amazing things together. So if you join now, you can come to that as well. So it's just lots of good things, lots of support, tons of sisterhood. We have Rally Guys too, guys support groups. So just follow us on Instagram for all the latest. You can always reach out to me. And thank you again for being here. I hope you have a good day. Sending love.